Hello everyone and welcome back to this special edition of Mr. Evans History. A lot of you have been learning about Black Tudors lately, and today I was joined by Dr Miranda Kaufmann, who is the author of the book that we've been looking at, Black Tudors. Now you've been looking at some of the lives of the Black Tudors if you're in Year 7 and Year 8. Year 7, I gave you the task of sending me any questions you'd like to hear answered by Dr Kaufmann, and today she answered some of those. Hi Dr Kaufmann, thanks for joining me. How are you today?
Hi, great. Yeah, I'm really well, thanks.
Great. My year sevens have been sending questions all week. They're really excited to hear what you've got to say about Black Tudors and just being a historian in general, really. So, first question that's been sent in, which a lot of pupils sent me, was what inspired you to research and write about the lives of Black Tudors?
Yeah, well, my mind wandered in a lecture. so I was at university and I was in my last year of undergrad, and I was trying to figure out what to research, because I wanted to carry on and do a master's and probably a doctorate.
Yeah.
I was in a lecture, and it was quite a dry lecture about early modern trade, and the lecturer sort of suddenly mentioned, in passing really, that the Tudors had started trading to Africa in the middle of the 16th century. And, I had pretty much grown up being fairly obsessed with the Tudors. I'd done them at primary school, secondary school. I'd watched loads of romantic films and read the novels and all the rest of it. I was just really surprised by that, because no one had ever taught me that. And so I, being a good student, went off to the library to try and find out more. And there wasn't a lot on it, but there were a few books, and I quite quickly came across some work by James Walvin and Peter Fryer and Falarin Shylon, I think. And it became clear, in Peter Fryer particularly, I think, that there had been Africans actually in Tudor England. They had these documents from Elizabeth I's Privy Council referring to great numbers of Africans being here, and so I had to find out more. So that it was a sort of curiosity thing, really, I suppose.
Cool. And how did you actually go about finding your evidence? Because we've seen that you've had trouble finding the evidence in the first place, and a lot of my pupils have asked, well, how did you go about finding it?
Yeah, well, I think most research, the first thing you do when you do a research project is try and do what they call historiography. So reading what all the other historians have ever written about it. So I read around that and followed footnotes and to find the original sources. Although actually a lot more had been written about it by people studying Shakespeare in the sort of more like in the English department, because they're looking at plays like Othello. And actually, Othello is famous, but there are lots of Black characters in early modern drama, and people have written whole books about that. So, but they were doing it from a kind of language and theatre perspective rather than the kind of cold hard facts of the Black presence here. So I also was extremely lucky at the beginning of my research to make contact with a woman called Marika Sherwood, who had established something called the Black and Asian Studies Association in 1991. And they had been gathering this sort of evidence for years, but publishing it in their newsletter, but it hadn't really made it to sort of public attention more broadly. And she sent me a list of maybe 100 references that they'd already collected. But they hadn't gone through everything, and I still haven't gone through everything, but that gave me quite a few clues. So, for example, if they had a record that one African person had been baptized in a particular parish, I went back to that parish and read through the entire parish register, and sometimes found that individual's burial or other people showing up there. So yeah, it was. But it'd probably be easier to do the work now than it was then, because increasing amounts of this information and documents from the time have been digitized and put online, and you can do word searches. So
yeah, much easier.
Still finding things, really.
What kept you motivated to find out your information going through the whole process?
Well, I think if you ask any historian, you're not always that motivated, but you've got to submit your final work, haven't you? But I think just that a sort of insatiable curiosity, and that feeling that there must be more evidence somewhere, because that very first sort of document said there are great numbers, you know, in 1590s, great numbers of Africans. And I was like, well, if there were great numbers, they must be somewhere. And, you know, it's the case of sort of just tracking them down. You sort of feel a bit like a detective.
So my pupils have been looking at John Blank and Catalina recently. A lot of them have asked me, who are you most interested in? Which person did you research that you found most interesting to find out about?
Well, I think, you know, it's in a way, it's always whichever one you're writing and researching about at the time that you kind of get into. And then, but obviously some of the source material was more exciting than others. I think the ones that get involved in court cases are always more fun because there's somebody having an argument about something. So that would be kind of Jack Francis, the salvage diver, is in a court case in the 1540s, or Edward Swarthy in the 1590s. He's the one who whipped a fellow servant called John Guy. So those ones are good. And I think Diego is probably the most dramatic story, you know, because he's you know, sailing around the world with Francis Drake and forging alliances with the Panama Maroons and you know, besting the Spaniards. And I mean, it's always really exciting when you find out more information about someone like that as well. Because I went back to there's quite a lot of, yeah, because people have always been interested in Drake. A lot of the records of the voyage have been printed, but when you go back, when I went back to the original document of one of those, I found a note in the margin that they hadn't printed, and it made it clear that Diego actually died on the voyage, but he died a year later than people had assumed. So then I was able to find references to him that didn't mention him by name, but once you knew he was still alive, it was clear that it was still him. You know, in some of the Spanish reports back to Madrid about what Drake was doing and who he was raiding and capturing off the coast of South America. So it's always, yeah, it's always exciting when you find something completely new.
Yeah, I think Diego has to be one of my favourites. I think you could quite easily make a film out of Diego's story. It'd be quite an interesting one, that one.
Yeah, it'd be great. Yeah. Yeah, I think I've had that thought too.
So you mentioned earlier that you're still finding new research all the time. Does that mean that you're still discovering new Black Tudors even to this day?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not looking at it into it particularly because I'm researching my next book now, which is on quite a different area. But people send me stuff now, you know, because they've read the book or know about my work, they'll just email me. So somebody sent me something fairly recently about he'd found, it's amazing. I mean, it's amazing what you can, what crops up really. So he'd found a diary written by a Hungarian who had visited England at some point in the 16th century, and he said he sort of recalled that he was walking through a wood, and suddenly a black man approaches him, and he was sort of surprised and a bit worried, and then the man started sort of speaking in English with a local accent, and it was clear he'd lived there, you know, all his life. And it's just this sort of crazy little encounter that sort of crops up in the original sources. But I am hoping, I'm working with a digital humanities department at the University of Lancaster, and hoping that be able to put up a kind of database based on my research and that of other people in the field like Onyeka Nubia and Imtiaz Habib, and expand it as well. So my doctoral thesis went up to 1640, but other people like Kathy Chater and Imtiaz Habib have looked at records that are later than that. And if we could have it all on a searchable database where you could just put in your postcode and it would come up with the nearest records, that would be really great. So yeah, there's always more to find.
That would be amazing, that database. Very helpful for history teachers, I think. So why do you think it's important for pupils to learn about Black Tudors in school?
I think what can be really damaging is if the first and sometimes only time that you learn about Black people in your history classes is in the context of slavery. You know, as if the only images you see are of Africans half naked in chains in pain, and that's it. You know, I think learning about the Black presence in Britain is just part of a sort of broader like a situation where you need to learn about African kingdoms and people in Africa before the Europeans showed up. How the richest man in world history was an African ruler called Mansa Musa, and that broader context. So I think it's just important to learn about the diversity of different experiences of African people in history, and how the encounter between black and white wasn't always one of enslavement.
So, what's it like to actually be a historian then? What's your day-to-day life like as a historian?
Well, I mean, different historians are doing different things. I suppose most historians have a sort of day job at university where they're teaching people, marking their work, giving lectures. I don't work like that at a university. I mostly work from home, so I'm mostly writing and researching. I do go and give lectures in universities, and I organise conferences, getting other people to talk about their work, and getting those conversations going between a kind of broader range of people interested in the history. Before the coronavirus, you go into libraries and read books there, and sometimes go into the archives, which is where you find the original manuscripts, written at the time, which is always quite amazing that they're still there. But a lot of the time now, I'm just sitting at my desk all day, trying to find some of those original sources online. Some of them are there, or ones that I took photographs of some time ago, and just trying to find out more and put it all together.
How long does it take you on average to research? How long, say, for Black Tudors, does it take you to research and write your book?
Well, it's a bit of an unusual case. Well, not completely unusual, but because I'd already written a whole doctorate on it before I came to sort of write the book, I think it took possibly less time. Well, I think I'm probably quite slow, but so the doctorate itself took 4 years. I tend to spend, I don't know, a bit of time looking at the context, then a year or two doing the actual research in the archives, and then another year trying to write it all up. But Black Tudors is obviously different to an academic thesis, because I was trying to get the stories across to a much broader audience. But because I was with my thesis, I was doing kind of more broadly analytical questions, like a chapter on how Africans came to Britain, or another one on what we know about their religious and social lives, whereas with the book it was based around these 10 individuals that I had the most information on. And so every time I went into one of those individuals, I then found out more about them than I had known before. But yeah, I think to write Black Tudors itself took me about 2 years, with a few breaks for maternity leave in between.
What advice would you give to any pupils who are interested in becoming historians in the future?
Read. Start reading, keep reading. I think I think it's a really brilliant thing to be able to do as your job. It's always fascinating. Do your homework, start reading, listen to your history teacher, if you want to be a historian, go and you can start being a historian right now. You don't have to, you're not maybe going to get paid for it right now, but you can start doing research. Like I said, anyone sitting at home on their computer can find so much original sources, and read other people's books, and you can start finding out about the past right now. And those are skills that will come in handy one day when you're giving keynote lectures at conferences.
Well, thank you very much for joining me, Dr. Kaufmann. I'm sure that'll be very valuable for my pupils and pupils around the country. You mentioned earlier you're working on a new book. What's that about? Can you give us a sneak preview?
Yeah, well, first we're just talking about teachers around the country. I think it's worth mentioning that I think we met through my initiative, Teaching Black Tudors, to try and get more teachers around the country to teach Black Tudors. I think quite a lot of people are interested in that, but we've been sharing resources online, and we're working towards sort of honing those resources and making them more widely available as well. My next book is called Heiresses, The Caribbean Marriage Trade, and it's about women who inherited fortunes from Caribbean sugar plantations that were worked on by enslaved Africans. And so obviously some of them became slaveholders themselves. And what they did, what their lives were like, what they did, what happened to the money, who they married. That some of them, well, most the ones I'm looking at married in Britain and brought that money with them. So that's that one.
Sounds very interesting. Are you still in the research process at the moment, or are you started?
Definitely. Well, I've still got quite a long way to go with it.
I'd like to thank Dr. Kaufmann for joining us today and answering your questions. If you're interested in finding out more about the Black Tudors, I'll leave a link to her website in the information below. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.